Welcome to Palestine Deep Dive, where I'm joined by Ambassador Husam Zomlot. And Husam is the head of the Palestinian Mission to the United Kingdom. Welcome, thanks very much for joining us today. I should just tell you something about Husam and his history. Husam is a Palestinian diplomat, he's an academic and an economist. And before his posting to the United Kingdom, he served as head of the PLO mission to the United States. And of course, as we know, the PLO mission to the US in Washington was closed by President Trump. And after the United States under the Trump administration had decided to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is, of course, as we know, in breach of international law. Now, Husam is a senior member of Fatah. He's a strategic advisor to the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. And he previously served as director of Fatah's Commission for Foreign Relations. And before entering politics, he was a professor of public policy at Birzeit University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University and an instructor at the University of London, and he's also worked as an economist with the United Nations Special Coordinator's Office in Palestine. And I think it would be very interesting for our viewers if we can begin actually really by talking to Husam about his family, because Husam's family lost their home, you lost your home and your livelihood back in 1948 during the Nakba. And for people who don't know what the Nakba is all about, I mean, the Nakba is essentially when Palestinians were driven in huge numbers, at least 750,000, I think, were driven from their homeland. To this day, many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are outside historic Palestine. They're living in Jordan and many other countries. And your family was driven out by militia and settlers into refugee camps, and I think that you were also born in Rafah in a refugee camp. So before we sort of get on to the issues that are happening around us today and some of the contemporary what's actually happening news-wise around us, I just wanted to find out something for the benefit of our viewers about you, because your story is a very, very powerful one. Unfortunately, it's not an unusual one, because so many people lost their homes, so many people have never gone back. And one thing that has certainly struck many of us at Palestine Deep Dive over the past few years is how many families were displaced, how many families have never been able to return to their homelands, and also how difficult it is for Palestinians who are still there in the historic homelands to move from one part to another. You can't travel from the West Bank to Gaza or vice versa, or East Jerusalem to West Bank. It's an extraordinary situation. Not many people really understand it. So I just wanted to begin by asking you something about your early memories, really, Ambassador. What happened that you can remember to your family? And have you ever managed to go back to your historic home, to your village? I mean, what has the Nakba meant to you and to many people that you knew and other families too?
Thank you, Mark, for having me first, and thank you for asking that question. I mean, there is a great deal of confusion, use of different terminologies about Palestine, because it's an aggression on the top of an aggression on the top of another. And it's crucial to pinpoint it right from the beginning that this was a settler colonialism exercise that has seen the Palestinian people ethnically cleansed from our homes. The 750,000 at the time were 2/3 of the Palestinian people. Some of these refugees had to take refuge in Gaza or in the West Bank or in countries, neighboring countries around Palestine like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and what have you. Gaza today has more than 2/3 of its population as refugees. And therefore it is absolutely crucial that we focus on the events that happened 75 years ago, not only on the events that happened 55 years ago, because that does miss the whole picture. When Israel occupies the remaining part of Palestine, the 22%, that is the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza, it had already committed the crime of ethnic cleansing, the crime of transfer by force, which is a crime against humanity and a war crime very well defined in international law. As for my own personal upbringing, the refugee camp is not an easy place to live in, but I think it was one of the most rich experiences of my life. And when I'm asked what has contributed to who you are, I always start with the Rafah Shabura refugee camp. My family hail from a small village called Simpson to the south of Palestine, which has become later Israel. And the entire village was forced out, like all the villages and the towns around them, and the hub of it at the time, which was Ashdod, Al-Majdal. Part of my family, including my own grandfather and father, who was born in Simpson, walked southward. So hence Gaza. Some went eastward, Jordan. So this is the first story, that families were ununited, disunited. Families were scattered all over. The catastrophe was not just the loss of our material base, as in the land and the property, which is severe in itself, but was the loss of the fabric of the society, the roots of the society. Yet our parents and grandparents have made every effort possible to shield us as children from that experience. And they made it absolutely clear to live for us as children as a normal life as possible. And because of that collective tragedy and collective suffering, the Nakba, the society was absolutely in an utter strong state of solidarity. So I remember that I usually have one mother. I used to have 20 mothers, because the entire neighborhood of the camp are your mothers and your fathers. There was that collective sort of way of living and collective way of healing. And I mean it, 20 mothers. Like one of them will just grab me and take me to the shower, and the other grab me and I'm cooking this and that. There was such a communal life, which brings in you that connection to your people, brings in you that belonging to your identity, and not only to your immediate family, but to your bigger family, that you are the son of a much bigger. And why was I born in Rafah? Rafah is the very last point, the most southern city of Palestine. After Rafah, actually there is an Egyptian Rafah, but Rafah, Palestinian Rafah, and an Egyptian Rafah. So Rafah is exactly on the border with Egypt, because my grandparents were walking with all their fellow Palestinians, ethnically cleansed, being shelled. They wanted to walk as far as possible from the atrocities and the killings, but they did not want to cross the borders out of Palestine. And I was born right on the borders, because the Shabura refugee camp is literally on the borders of Egypt. So that's another memory of, wanting to shield, to protect their families from the attacks, but at the same time did not want their families to be born out of Palestine. So there are many vivid memories, Mark, but the key one of all of this is that the refugee camp has really gave me what it takes to grow up and to learn, about my grandfathers and fathers' suffering, but also to learn about the strength of my society, the beauty of my society, the culture of my society, the different foods of my society, because the camp was made of people coming from different towns, and therefore you are also exposed to different,
Have you ever been able to return to your home, to your family's home?
Yes. My grandfather took me, I was 6 years old, I remember. He took me first time to his original home, which was scattered stones, like all other homes in that village, Simpson. They had destroyed it completely. They kept some, stone structures of the homes, and it's empty. It's not like they destroyed it and they built something in it, or they kept the homes and they lived in it like they did in other places. In our village, they completely leveled it, destroyed it, and kept it until this day empty, very empty.
You see, if I may,
the revengeful act. This is not about just inhabiting a land. This is about destroying, and so nobody can claim to come back. But my grandfather managed to find his fig tree, and that was the experience that I remember all of my life, because he was looking and looking. He could not locate the exact house until he found the fig tree that he planted.
Wow.
He planted, and you could see his smile, and then my smile, because we went in the summer when the fig leaf was already there and still fruiting. And I remember him telling me, if this fig leaf is still fruiting, one day, Husam, in your lifetime, and if not in yours, maybe in your children, you will come and eat from this fig tree. So it's that environment. And you know what's the biggest irony of all this? At the time when he drove me, it was the late 70s. So there were no borders. Israel had occupied Gaza and the West Bank. So you could drive your car from anywhere to anywhere in historic Palestine. No checkpoints, no nothing. It took us something like 30 minutes to drive from the refugee camp to our destroyed village. And the irony in a child, and I kept asking my grandfather and my father at the time, why don't we go back? As a child. Yes. I mean, it took us, I barely finished my sandwich in the car. Why don't we go back? What is preventing you, father, from building our house again? And I like it better because it's more on the beach and, has better landscape and surrounding. What hits me the most is what separates between you and your original home is half an hour by car, yet you are unable to go back. That was the epitome of injustice.
Yes, and you see, this is why I think this is very important, especially for British audiences, because very often you get called upon to appear on the British media, and it will, more often than not, I've watched it, it'll be, we have the Palestinian ambassador, we're going to ask him about the latest violence in Israel-Palestine, and particularly violence against Israelis. There's never any context. They will argue there's not enough time for it. But actually, the British have taken a long time, it seems to me, to begin to understand their role, historically, as a colonial power, in actually creating some of the boundaries and some of the countries and some of the situations that we live through now. And only just coming to terms, if you like, with, for instance, partition in India, or partition in Ireland, or settler colonialism in Rhodesia and South Africa, and yet there's a sticking point, a dam, a blocking point that means that there's no real discussion about Britain's role in Palestine. So my question to you is, when I look at that historic footage of the flag, British flag being pulled down in the Mandate, and for people watching this, the British, after the Ottoman Empire was defeated, but largely with Arab armies, took the Mandate for Palestine. But when that Union flag was pulled down in Haifa, I think in 1948, there were no Palestinians, there were no Palestinian Arabs, it was just Israelis. So what is your thought about all of that? Was the decision made back in 1948 that essentially this new arrangement, this partition was over for the Palestinians back then? The British walked away, and yet there is a historic responsibility that the British still won't face up to.
Well, it didn't start, Mark, in 1948, the whole British responsibility and role. It started in 1917 with the Balfour, infamous Balfour Declaration. 76 words, exactly. In these words, Britain promises our land without consulting us. That colonial arrogance. And in that declaration, they promise to establish a homeland for the Jewish people with one condition, that homeland, that state, would respect the religious and civil rights of minorities. The British Empire at the time has turned us, the indigenous native population, who have lived there for millennia, who have produced almost every prophet, the cardinal of civilization and the hub and the bridge between East and West, who at the time we owned 98% of the land, they turned us into minorities with no political or collective or national rights, only, remember, civil and religious. So we are only allowed to pray in our own home, in our own land, only allowed to pray. And since then, things have really begun. The real beginning, the starting point of our catastrophe, Nakba, of our oppression, started in 1917. And therefore, I'm glad you're asking this question, because Britain has a very unique moral, historical, and political, and legal, actually, responsibility. And this is not by way of creating blame, but by way of seeking leadership and statesmanship by the United Kingdom to right all the wrongs, to correct the history, and to do what is right. And that puts on the UK an extra pressure to actually do so.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you, because...
And by the way, Mark, let me come again here, because 2 years after the Balfour Declaration, Britain was entrusted by the United Nations, the League of Nations,
that's right, for the mandate,
to take the mandate of Palestine, to actually sort it out and make sure that the rights of the majority at the time, us, that the region is stable, and the promises to the Arab League and the Arab nations. And Britain took the mandate over Palestine, entrusted by the rest of the world, and guess what? They took the mandate of Palestine to curb and crush Palestinian nationalism and resistance, and to actually see the birth of that promise they make, the homeland, and not care for the catastrophe that happened to my grandparents that we just started talking about, leaving the mess all behind, and since then, not enabling us in a real way to actually reverse that very unjust situation.
And by the way, I mean, most people in this country have seen this great film, Lawrence of Arabia. D.H. Lawrence is seen as a great British hero who actually believed in the promise that was made by the British at the time, and always felt betrayed in his life until his untimely end at that betrayal. And when people understand things like that, they begin to see things in a slightly different way. But I wanted to ask you about, essentially, the campaign for Palestinian independence has been continuing for, over a century. And in 1988, in Algiers, I think about 138 out of 193 member states of the United Nations have ended up recognizing Palestinian independence from that declaration in Algiers. And of course, you've got non-observer status at the United Nations, a very powerful diplomatic presence, and a lot of support in the General Assembly historically. And also Palestine has been recognized by a number of European countries, but not Britain. We are sitting here in your mission. It's not an embassy yet. And many people, from what we were just talking about then, about Britain's historic responsibility and the need for leadership, and yet we still have a situation whereby Britain has not recognised Palestine, which would be a very important thing to happen. More importantly, in many respects, in recent weeks, has voted against that vote in the General Assembly for the International Court of Justice to examine the legal implications of the occupation. So what's your message for British politicians? And also, I guess, because there may well be a change of government in a couple of years' time, for the official opposition in this country, which is the Labour Party, which has a commitment to recognise Palestine. What is your message for British politicians as to the importance of diplomatic recognition?
To do what is right, not what is comfortable, and to really represent Britain as Britain wants to be, which is global Britain that safeguards international legality and international law. If they safeguard international law is clear. It has given the Palestinians the full right of self-determination and a state. And now in the United Nations, we are a state. We are an observer member, but a state, the State of Palestine. It's very regrettable. Britain has missed at least 4 opportunities, historic opportunities, to right the wrong. And the beginning of that was an apology for all that we have discussed. And it is apology is not weakness. Apology is strength. It's a recognition of people suffering, and your role. Apology allows you to lead the way and to have a legitimate role, but also recognition of the state of Palestine. Britain missed an opportunity in 1999 when the Oslo Accords concluded after 5 years. There was supposed to be a state. Britain and other Western powers should have said, okay, the Palestinians and the Israelis have signed this accord. They agreed to have two states after the end of this interim period, 5 years, 1999. We recognize the state of Palestine and we give the two parties equal footing and we level the field. Britain did not do that. Again, in 2012, we go to the General Assembly, we seek membership of the state, and the world vote with us, but Britain does not. Again, in 2014, the United Kingdom Parliament votes overwhelmingly to recognize the state of Palestine, including conservative members, but Labour, and, cross-party. The UK government completely disregarded that. Another opportunity missed, because the UK Parliament is not a charity. That is the political will of the British people. When they come and tell you, you have got to recognize the state of Palestine, they give you the platform and the opportunity to actually do so and correct that 100 years of wrong history. And the fourth opportunity, unfortunately, was missed in 2017. That was 100 years for the Balfour Declaration.
Yes.
Prime Minister Theresa May had such an opportunity to actually say, okay, 100 years on, we have seen all the agony and the suffering of the Palestinian people. We have seen the outcome of what has happened. We have never meant this to happen. And this is an opportunity to actually recognize the state of Palestine. Missed. Instead, Theresa May comes out and says how proud we are to have issued the Balfour Declaration. Today we celebrate it. She brought salt in that deep wound.
Yes.
And that's why our work here is to help change these dynamics, because we believe we have all what it takes in this country. We have the public opinion and the masses is changing. We have many friends in the political parties and in the parliament. And we believe that this issue is being discussed seriously in many British official quarters. We no longer take the position that the UK will recognize in due time. This doesn't add up, because in due time means, or they tell us that after a final agreement is reached. That's the key sort of policy point. Once you reach a final agreement, we will recognize. It's a matter of when, not if. And we tell them, if you are waiting for a final agreement, why did you recognize one state of the two states? Wait for the final agreement for the two states. And we know you will not be able to de-recognize the state that you have recognized. It's better that you recognize the second state. It's easier, it's less costly.
Yes.
But you know what's the essence? What's the very heart of we wait for a final agreement to recognize? What is it? What is it?
Delaying factor.
No, I'm sorry. No. They are telling us, and they are telling Israel and everybody involved, that only if and when Israel accepts us to recognize, we will recognize. That is not leadership.
So going from that, you've just had Secretary of State Blinken, who's gone to Israel this past few days, and he describes the West Bank. No mention of the occupied Palestinian territories. He goes to Israel. He says, "I'm going to Israel. I'm going to the West Bank." So he and his government have the power, should they wish, to bring about the situation you just talked about, to bring about a settlement by pushing people together, if they really want to, as they arguably could be doing in Russia and Ukraine. But they're not doing that, and they have the power. Secretary of State Blinken has the power to say to the Israeli government, particularly this government, which they're very uncomfortable with, if you don't sit down with the Palestinians and work out this two-state solution, which they still say they believe in, we're going to turn the money tap off. It never happens, does it? So what is it going to take to get a degree of alacrity, of prioritizing the situation in Palestine? We have a situation in eastern Ukraine where the international community can move in days to have the International Court of Justice investigate war crimes. It can take years for anything to happen in Palestine. What is it that's going to stop this kind of complete lack of consistency when it comes to occupation Because from where many of people are coming from now, it appears that you can be occupied if you're Christian and you're white in Ukraine. But when it comes to Palestine, well, it's a different matter. So what changes that?
Well, and that hypocrisy and that double standards and selectivity is really creating content worldwide with the people who are watching and following all that. And they see what you are doing. And they see what is happening. And you know what's the key thing there? The world, the people of the world are watching that international law, international rules are applied only on foes. When it comes to friends, they are completely quitted. They are put above the law. In fact, it was in the words of Prime Minister Johnson, Boris Johnson, when he issued a public letter saying why he opposes us going to the ICC. He mentions in the letter because Israel is our ally and friend. So when any entity is your friend, the rules do not apply. When it is your foe, the rules apply. There's sheer hypocrisy. I mean, the US, you asked me about the US. Okay, Secretary Blinken visited Ramallah. He said all the right things. They are pro two-state solution, i.e. international resolutions, that the Palestinians and the Israelis have to have equal measures of freedom and security and dignity and opportunity. We agree with all that. And that all unilateral acts, i.e. the illegal colonial settlements must cease. We agree. But either Mr. Blinken has no approach or he has the wrong approach. And I think he has the wrong approach, because to achieve that, you need the power of the US. And by the way, you are absolutely right in your assessment. If the US wants, it happens. And because it happened before, in the Madrid conference in 1992, the US president at the time, President Bush, the father, brought Shamir kicking and screaming. In spite of his will. So the US, and many other cases when the US decides, it happens. The question is why the US is not deciding. And you mentioned Ukraine. The US arms the Ukrainian resistance, and in our case the US arms the occupier, the colonizer, the besieger, the one that commits ethnic cleansing, the one that commits annexation. What's the heart of international law? What is the essence of the pillar of international law? The inadmissibility of acquiring land by force. That's the heart of it. It was created after the Second World War and the mayhem and the horrors of the Second World War. So what is the difference between annexing land in Ukraine and occupying land in Ukraine and annexing land in the occupied West Bank? I think the essence is that still there are some quarters in the US and elsewhere that sees the Palestinians not worthy of the same rights. Not worthy of the national rights, that they see Israel of much greater strategic value to discuss the common rules that apply on everyone.
Yes, but sorry to interrupt you, but they can't get Israel, for instance, to aid Ukraine right now. So this idea that Israel is this fantastic security ally doesn't always stack up. And you just wonder. So we have a Biden administration that is essentially keeping the same kind of policies as the Trump administration, that hasn't reversed the decision over Jerusalem. It makes more emollient noises, possibly. The visit from someone like Blinken would not have happened under Trump. But at the same time, you could argue that at least Trump and his administration were honest in their support for Israel. So what is it that... Is it? I mean, do you think that looking at...
Trump was very destructive.
Oh yes, he was very destructive. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that the opportunities to reverse some of this, it hasn't happened really from the Biden administration. He hasn't reversed a lot of these Trump changes. Even also, by the way, when it comes to Western Sahara, an occupation that the US supports. I mean, crazy. So what is it? Do you think, though, that looking at this administration, Israel, which even for people in the American establishment is beyond the pale. You've got a finance minister proudly declaring himself to be a fascist homophobe. You've got a Ben Gvir who's got I don't know how many convictions behind his name and essentially a racist. These are people that the Americans are now having to deal with. This isn't normalcy, is it? So does this, and the threat also of another intifada, if you like, possibly it's already happening, I don't know. Perhaps this is what will change the American view, because they don't want to lose control of a situation. They don't want a situation to explode beyond their control. Do you think that the situation is now so dangerous in Palestine that the Americans could change their policy?
I hope so. And they might actually lose any impact and influence, because what Trump did and then the lack of any reversal by Biden is diminishing the US influence. Because, if you actually move your embassy, if you completely take one side, if you close our mission, our diplomatic representation in Washington, and you close your consulate general in East Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem. And remember, it was established in 1844, that consulate, long before Israel was established. And if you cut all of your funding to the Palestinians, as Trump did, then you are nobody. I mean, in the end, you have no leverage on anybody. And now, with the changes all around us and the new world powers that are present physically in the region, the US has to think seriously and think twice of what role and what impact and what influence it wants. And the key word in this whole discussion about the Israeli government, Mark, is accountability. You have all these convicted racists and criminals in the Israeli government in very high offices because of the lack of accountability. And why do we have lack of accountability? It's because of the US, sometimes the UK, the West in general, going out of their way to shield Israel from any scrutiny, any accountability. That explains your earlier question about voting against us and referring Israel for an advisory opinion of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you really want to change the dynamics, be it in the UK or in the US vis-a-vis Israel, and if you really want to change the dynamics in Israel, and if you really want to see the beginning of electing people who would actually produce a peace process and end this situation, you've got to associate illegality with consequences. And you've got to create accountability for all this wrongdoing for all these years. And short of doing so, you will find Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to be dovish in 5 years' time, because the Israeli public, very comfortable, no cost associated with the illegality, will keep producing and electing even more
extreme people.
Netanyahu, who was seen to be the most right-wing in the Israeli politics only a few years back, now he's seen to be even dovish compared to these guys. And the trajectory of things will keep going in that direction. So that's why we are adamant about the use of international law and the international judicial system, and not only the ICJ, but the ICC, because the ICC is meant to stop these young soldiers or officers from pulling the triggers, killing children, killing civilians, killing this with full impunity. The ICC is a deterrent, primarily individual deterrent, but the ICJ is a collective deterrent, i.e. we want to revisit the whole system of occupation, colonization, apartheid, and besiegement. And therefore, so long as the West continues to shield Israel, I don't think they can have a genuine, credible role in any peacemaking. The moment you see the US or the UK vote for referring illegality to the international system, a moment when you start counting when these countries will actually contribute to peacemaking in our region.
That's very interesting. And this is a terrible question to ask you in a way, but do you think in a way that things almost get worse, so bad that they then begin to get better? Because you're talking about the trajectory of these Israeli politicians, which in our lifetimes we've seen become more and more extreme. And we've seen this elsewhere in the world too, by the way. Another settler, I remember growing up with Rhodesia, they became more and more extreme. And then it just got so bad that the world could not tolerate this anymore. Do you think that's a trajectory? It's not a preferable one, because all the suffering that's going to happen in the meantime.
The problem here, Mark, is that what could be worse than this? What could be worse? And we keep saying we are at a bottom rock, and then it's even worse and worse and worse. I think if it's bleakest before dawn, then it is getting very bleak, really bleak. With the current Israeli government, with the killing at will, with the full impunity, with the rampage of the settlers in the occupied West Bank everywhere, with Palestinian people being absolutely brutalized on the hundreds of checkpoints, with them not knowing if they send their children to school, they would be, arrested or shot at the checkpoints, or even gassed. The tear gas that they throw into schools. The whole thing is becoming completely unbearable. So I'll tell you the truth. My real hope is not in the governments. The governments are calculating more than they are implementing a principle. My hope, as far as Israel-Palestine is concerned, as far as the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people, is in the people of the world. My hope is in the Arab world, and despite and regardless of all that happened, you've seen what happened in Qatar in the World Cup. You've seen the Moroccan team when they won the semi-final.
Oh yes,
they had the Palestinian flag.
The street is with you big time.
Which something we can capitalize on, and we can lean on and rely on and bank on. But we also have the people of the world, and we have the hundreds of thousands. Did you see the demonstrations in London in 2021 when Israel attacked Gaza, and before it Sheikh Jarrah and ethnic cleansing? I was there. I was absolutely amazed to see more than 200,000 people in the streets of London supporting Palestine and condemning the Israeli acts. Remember, you mentioned South Africa earlier. Governments came very late in the game for South Africa.
Yes.
Very late in the game, including the Thatcher government and the Reagan administration. In fact,
just this much. That's what she said.
Just
when it came to sanctions.
Just this
but
much.
She was one, and the whole of the Commonwealth against her.
But what changed things? It was the great people of Britain, the great people of Europe and everywhere else, the anti-apartheid movement. You know, South Africa House stands in the middle of Trafalgar Square here in London, a symbol of what London did, because the whole thing emanated from London. This was the capital of anti-apartheid. As a Palestinian ambassador myself, I go all over here, all over your country. I see that happening. So it's a matter of time when the people will deliver their verdict. There is a lot of resistance against them, like happened in South Africa. It took hundreds of years, my friend. Things take time. But the trajectory of things are definitely in the direction of the right
and
the justice. And the more involvement by all these citizens of the world, the more action by these citizens of the world, and in the end, governments will have to follow.
Well, because we can't take up too much more of your time, Ambassador, because I wanted to almost end with more positive, some of the positive notes that you've just been sounding then, from your visits around this country, what you see elsewhere in the world. We have seen a transformation, even over the past year or two, about whether it comes from B'Tselem or Amnesty International or the United Nations. Israeli apartheid has entered the lexicon big time, right across the West. There is much more awareness of what's going on, partly, possibly, you may agree or not, through social media. People aren't just waiting for a documentary that might come once a year. They can see almost every day, which is why there are Israeli members of the Knesset who want to stop filming of what's going on in the occupied territories, as you know. So do you take some hope from that? Are you optimistic from the fact that what you've seen amongst people is things are moving in the right way, but also because they're being empowered by the information that they're able to see now?
The resistance against us is huge, especially by the information and the media outlets. There is a lot of effort by the mainstream media in this country, in the US, in the West in general, to stifle the debate, to frame it, to deflate it. Look at the last couple of weeks. I mean, headlines of BBC and others. The BBC, the headline when Ben Gvir raided Al-Aqsa Mosque in the early hours of the morning. What was the headline? Palestinian rage at Minister Ben Gvir. So what was the news? That we are angry. There is a rage. The news is not his illegal act of actually invading a mosque that is a place of prayer for Muslims. And the same thing goes on and on. I can give you 100 examples. I was interviewed the last few days by several British and international media outlets, and always attempts and focus on deflating us from the key issues, of drawing some false symmetry. But guess what? That has been happening for a long time. They are losing the grip and the control, thanks to many things, including the social media, by the way, and citizen activism, if I may, the individuals, the youth of this country, the youth of Palestine, the youth of the Arab world, and the youth everywhere. But also, if you look at a longer perspective, when Israel was established 75 years ago, people here in this country saw that as a miracle. The bloom in the desert, the miracle that has brought this state against all the Arab armies. Remember, the socialist experience, remember the kibbutzim, actually the generation of the 50s and the 60s, most of the British people spent time in the Israeli kibbutzim, the social. But where are we now in comparison to that time? I think Israel's reputation, Israel's situation has been exposed. I think things have changed. I don't think anybody in his right mind or her right mind would tell you that Israel is the beacon of democracy and the only democracy. People now know. It takes time. It's a long journey. It's very painful. It has seen so much bloodshed, so many sufferings, thousands of Palestinians killed, hundreds of thousands imprisoned, homes demolished, curfews and besiegement, Gaza under siege for 16 years and ongoing. It's unprecedented, unparalleled, unmatched suffering at this mass, gross level for sustained 100 years. But yet, I do believe that things are going in our direction.
And finally, Ambassador, I'm thinking about growing up in this country, in the British Labour Party, where many of the strongest supporters of Palestine were often Jewish socialists. And you yourself have said when you've been asked about this, we're not interested in who our oppressors are, we're interested in the nature of the occupation and defeating it. What do you think of what we see increasingly over the past 2 or 3 years? And it's been a deeply, deeply unpleasant thing, especially for many Jewish people who have been great supporters of Palestine and are sometimes anti-Zionists. What do you say to those people who are constantly being shut down and accused of being anti-Semitic, who may be Jewish or they may not be, but who are supportive of Palestine? What do you have to say about this claim that is frequently made, that if you're supporting the Palestinians, you are somehow being anti-Semitic?
Well, first of all, anti-Semitism is real. It does exist. We must fight it and fight it fiercely and uproot it. And nothing hurts the Palestinian issue more than anti-Semitism. And it happened. The history is very clear all over us. The most heinous crime of the Holocaust. And before it, Jews were persecuted almost in every country. So anti-Semitism is vile and it must be uprooted. But so is the Israeli occupation. It's the same fight. And I think everybody who has principles will never fight anti-Semitism and not fight the Israeli colonial expansion in the West Bank, will never be able to claim that they have the same principles. And therefore my advice to our friends is to keep on and go on. Sometimes it is difficult. I said it in many previous encounters. Our issue is not with the identity of our oppressors. In fact, there are many non-Jews in the Israeli army. There are Muslims and Christians in the Israeli army who are our oppressors. So our issue is not with the identity of our oppressors. Our issue is with the fact of our oppression. What we are struggling against is the oppression, not the identity of the oppressors. And this is something that we need to remind ourselves of all the time. And as you said, the biggest supporters of Palestine worldwide, not only in the UK, are Jewish people, Jewish leaders. I have many friends who are Jews. Our issue is not with the Jewish people, definitely. Our issue is with a state that has decided it wants to control our lives forever, despite our will. Our issue is that we have the birthright of being free, of being independent, of having to decide on our own lives and future. And we are not interested in a permanent military occupation or a permanent colonial settlement expansion. We are interested in having a neighborly relationship, but on equal footing, and we all respect the basic universal values and basic international provisions.
Ambassador Zomlot, thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you to all who are watching. Please join us again next time at Palestine Deep Dive. So from the Palestine Mission here in London, thank you. Goodbye, and thank you once again to Ambassador Zomlot.